Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to Stately Vaughan Manor, where Roger and I have returned. Because it's Wednesday, that means it's Epic Comic Book Wednesday. Every Wednesday, we'll talk about a certain comic book, graphic novel, or comic book subject. Steve Donoghue over on his channel will talk about the same comic book, graphic novel, or comic book subject. It is our world's finest team up that we do once a week. And this week, we're talking about Spider-Man. Yeah, again. We're talking about Spider-Man again. So yeah, I'm reading every issue of Spider-Man from the first run of Spider-Man. So yeah, I've got Spider-Man on the brain a little bit. But today we're talking about one of his most persistent and terrible villains. We are. And Spider-Man has a great rogues gallery. I mean, he has some of the best villains in comic books. But this particular villain is his most persistent and terrible villain. And he is featured in this issue, issue number 20. This is The Coming of the Scorpion. This is from The Great Run by Stan Lee and Steve Ditko. And Steve Ditko is at the top of his game in this issue. Here we have the Scorpion lifting Spider-Man up over his head. On the splash page, he's kicking Spider-Man's ass. You know, the Scorpion was terrible, but he is not the villain that I'm speaking of. No, that villain is Jonah Jameson. Jonah Jameson was terrible. He was the worst. And it's his fault that the Scorpion even exists. So Jonah Jameson hates Spider-Man, and we know that he hates Spider-Man because he's jealous of Spider-Man. He has admitted it himself in a previous issue that he is jealous of Spider-Man and Spider-Man's selfless nobility. And so he wants to tear Spider-Man down. And sometimes he decides to do illegal things, like hire somebody to beat up Spider-Man. Like he does in this issue. He actually creates, or helps to create, a supervillain, the Scorpion. So this is a great story. It introduces the Scorpion, who is a pretty good villain. Like I said, Spider-Man has some great villains. And it starts off with a bang with this great splash page and that wonderful cover. It actually starts off our story with Peter Parker, who's being followed. So here you have some classic Steve Ditko 9-page panels here. Everything is very cramped and claustrophobic in some of Steve Ditko's panels. It is part of his storytelling style, but you can get a lot of story told in pages like this. And when Peter Parker starts off, he is being followed by somebody somebody mysterious. This mysterious guy in a hat is following Peter Parker around. And of course, Peter Parker is worried about, does this guy know I'm Spider-Man? Is he suspicious that I'm Spider-Man? Who is this guy? We don't know. But we do know that he's being followed around. And he's hanging outside Peter Parker's house, and Peter Parker has to decide, what the heck am I going to do about this guy? Meanwhile, we shift to our real villain, Jonah Jameson. And Jonah Jameson is pissed because, Spider-Man's still out there being Spider-Man. And he says, if only there were someone stronger than him that I could hire. But he had just read a news article about some nutty scientist. He read an article about some nutty scientist. What's this news item? Some nutty scientist claims to have found ways to cause artificial mutations in animals. Huh, big deal. Why do my editors bother showing me proofs of every unimportant story that comes along? But as he's musing about Spider-Man, he realizes, hey, this might be the answer. This nutty scientist perhaps can help me out. This is my greatest inspiration. I'll rid the world of Spider-Man once and for all. I'll probably get a medal. Now, his idea is like, hey, if this guy can cause these mutations in animals, maybe he can cause these mutations in a human being, creating a superpowered human being that could beat up Spider-Man. That's Jonah Jameson's brilliant idea. He's going to create his own supervillain. And it turns out that the guy that was following around Peter Parker shows up at J. Jonah Jameson's office. You see, J. Jonah Jameson's the one that hired this guy to follow Peter Parker around because he wanted to find out how Peter Parker gets those fantastic news photos that he does, not realizing that Peter Parker is Spider-Man and takes pictures of himself fighting supervillains. But he says, that's not as important as what I've got going for you now. So this thug, basically, that J. Jonah Jameson hired is just, he's basically that. He's a thug who will do anything for money. He'll literally do anything for cash. Meanwhile, we have our soap opera portion with Betty Brant, and suddenly now there's a love triangle with this new guy, Ned Leeds, and this is going to lead to some tedious soap opera-ness in the future. But we get through that, and we see J. Jonah Jameson goes and visits this scientist, not knowing this is the worst move the scientist has ever made, letting these guys in, And he's a poor guy, this scientist. And so when J. Jonah Jameson says, I'm gonna offer you $10,000 if you help mutate my friend and make him into a supervillain. I'll give you 10 grand if you did that. And the scientist says, I'm a research scientist. I don't accept private jobs for pay. And yet, with $10,000, I could buy new equipment, new materials. I just am not in a position to refuse you, Mr. Jameson. What is your project? So this is a terrible move by this scientist, which leads to his doom. You should never accept money from obvious criminals. And in this case, J. Jonah Jameson and his thuggish friend are obviously criminals. Because, like I said, it's against the law to hire somebody to beat up somebody else, even if that somebody else is Spider-Man. These sort of rules and laws are forgotten in the Marvel Universe, I understand, but still. So the scientist is able to make this guy a supervillain. So does all these experiments, shaves his head, and whips up a fancy costume to make him the Scorpion. He also is a great engineer, it turns out, this scientist, because he creates this scorpion tail, which is, just basically a big club that's strapped to his back that can shoot around him and hit things. It's his great weapon, his club that's on his back. He's a scorpion. I guess he's got to have a tail, according to Stan Lee. So, yeah. He's already super strong, but now he's got a super strong tail. So now he's the Scorpion. Unfortunately, this process, which has turned this guy into a Scorpion, also is driving him insane. Which is never a good thing, Roger, to have superpowers and be driven insane. Now as it turns out, he's actually stronger, physically stronger than Spider-Man, if you could believe it. He's that tough. And so, eventually, after talking to J. Jonah Jameson, and J. Jonah Jameson tries to stall Spider-Man and keep him in his office, Spider-Man gets wise and then tries to get away because he knows it's a trap. But along comes the Scorpion, and they have this great fight. And Spider-Man is pretty surprised because he hasn't come across a supervillain this powerful before. So this is a new one for Spider-Man. And Spider-Man, unfortunately, gets his ass kicked. Even his web can't slow down the Scorpion. In a very bizarre panel, Spider-Man sprays him with his web, but then the Scorpion says, I just remembered something, webhead. Scorpions have powerful pinchers which they use at will. And since I have the Scorpion's powers, and then he uses his fingers to snap his way out of the web. This makes no sense. How do your fingers... I guess now he has even stronger super fingers that can pinch his way out of Spider-Man's, I don't know. Stan Lee sometimes just came up with this stuff. So J. Jonah Jameson is watching all this from his office, and he is thrilled. Now, all this time, I was wondering, reading this story, what is J. Jonah Jameson's ultimate plan here? Does he just want to beat Spider-Man up? Because that's not going to get rid of Spider-Man. Does he want to kill Spider-Man? That's pretty bad, because then you're a murderer, right? You can't just hire somebody to murder somebody you don't like. What is his plan? It turns out his plan is to have Spider-Man get beaten up, brought into his office, and then he would unmask Spider-Man and find out who Spider-Man is, thus causing the end of Spider-Man, or so J. Jonah Jameson believes. Meanwhile, the scientist is back at his laboratory and realizes that, oh no, the superpowers I gave this guy are slowly driving him insane. Jeez, I didn't mean to do that. I better come up with an antidote. So he does. He comes up with an antidote to take away the Scorpion's powers. And for some reason, he thinks the Scorpion will just go along with this. Meanwhile, the Scorpion has kicked the crap out of Spider-Man, and Spider-Man is unconscious. And the Scorpion is thrilled. Look at me, I beat up Spider-Man. I could do anything. And so he suddenly realizes, of course, well, now I don't need J. Jonah Jameson. I don't need the $10,000 he was going to give me if I have superpowers and can just rob as much money as I want. Now that Spider-Man's gone, who's going to stop me? And J. Jonah Jameson realizes his mistake as the Scorpion takes off. He's like, hey, come back. You're supposed to bring Spider-Man here for me to unmask. And Scorpion just doesn't care. Scorpion's going off to rob an armored car, which he does right away. So he immediately starts burglarizing this armored car. In the meantime, and J. Jonah Jameson is, of course, pretty worried because now he realizes he is directly responsible for creating a supervillain who is committing crimes. This isn't the best scheme that J. Jonah Jameson has come up with. Meanwhile, Spider-Man recovers and is like, okay, he kicked the crap out of me, but now I gotta keep fighting. I gotta stop this guy. Because you can't defeat Spider-Man just by beating him up once. And so the scientist runs and finds the Scorpion and tries to get him to take this formula. The Scorpion refuses and takes off and starts crawling up a building. And the scientist starts crawling up the building after him. This scientist has skills. So he's crawling up the building after him and tries to throw the formula at him to, turn him back normal. But he misses. And he falls off the building and dies. So the scientist who was hired by J. Jonah Jameson dies. J. Jonah Jameson's stupid project to create the supervillain has led to his death. So, let this be a lesson to you. Never let anybody hire you to create a supervillain. It only leads to misery, Roger. It only leads to misery. Trust me, I know. It's a bad idea. Meanwhile, Spider-Man has caught up with the Scorpion, and we have another awesome battle. And here's J. Jonah Jameson realizing exactly what he has done. He's like, nobody knows it, but it's all my fault. I'm the one to blame. If not for me, there would be no Scorpion. Just to satisfy my own personal hatred, I tried to destroy Spider-Man. And in so doing, I've unleashed a far worse menace upon the world. A menace I can no longer control. A menace no one can control. And meanwhile, Scorpion continues to beat up Spider-Man. And knocks him out again. So second round, Spider-Man loses again. Then Spider-Man wakes up, all his uniform's all torn up, and he hears a scream. It's Betty Brant who screams a lot because she's always being menaced by supervillains. J. Jonah Jameson pushes her out of the room when the Scorpion jumps into J. Jonah Jameson's office. Seemingly a heroic move, but really he just doesn't want her to hear anything the Scorpion might say that would implicate him in the creation of the Scorpion. But then comes Spider-Man before there can be any real trouble. And he's going to actually defend his arch enemy, J. Jonah Jameson, from the Scorpion. And at this point, Spider-Man has figured out how to defeat the Scorpion. He knows he just can't go toe-to-toe with this guy. So he does a lot of dodging, and he rips off his Scorpion tail, so that weapon is no longer in action, and eventually defeats him, which shocks J. Jonah Jameson. He's like, you beat him. You defeated somebody who's stronger than you. And his mind is boggled. He can't believe it. And that is pretty much of the end of the story. Poor Peter Parker is just all beat up, and he has to come up with some kind of story about how he was playing football, and Aunt May has to patch him up. Of course, Peter Parker playing football is pretty unlikely. And Jameson takes all the credit for Scorpion's capture. Nobody knows that, now that the scientist is dead, that J. Jonah Jameson is responsible for the Scorpion. I guess the Scorpion just isn't talking. You think the Scorpion could tell somebody, but, maybe he's so insane at this point that he doesn't remember. Who knows? And at the end, is he repentant, J. Jonah Jameson? Of course not. I know now that anyone with too much power is liable to turn into a menace sooner or later, and Spider-Man is no exception. It's still my duty to fight him, to expose and to someday destroy him. And I will if it takes the rest of my life. I will. And meanwhile, Peter Parker is left at home to sew up his damaged costume. We get this cool pinup of Peter Parker and Spider-Man, and it's altogether a pretty awesome issue. And I have to mention just how great, like I said, just how great the artwork is in this issue. Steve Ditko, man, was at this point in his career just fantastic. He was literally at the top of his game when he was doing this issue. Over time, Steve Ditko kind of lost some of that, but at this point in his career, he was absolutely fantastic. And this was a great issue, and it focuses on a great villain, J. Jonah Jameson, and I'll shut up because that's all I have to say about it. I will catch you next time, probably in a couple days. I will see you then.